Chapter 20. The next day, Olin went alone to the spot where he and the old man startled the stag. Instead of passing round through the gate, he climbed over the prickly hedge, as everyone else did. And before he had time to pull out the thorns that had caught in his coat, his dog, which had run on in the front, started 2 pheasants. He had hardly stepped among the briars when the pheasants began to rise at every step. The old man had not shown him that place the day before, as he meant to keep it for shooting from behind the screen. Olin fired 12 times and killed 5 pheasants, but clambering after them through the briars, he got so fatigued that he was drenched with perspiration. He called off his dog, uncocked his gun, put in a bullet above the small shot, and brushing away the mosquitoes with the wide sleeves of his Circassian coat, he went slowly to the spot where they had been the day before. It was, however, impossible to keep back the dog, who found trails on the very path, and Olin killed 2 more pheasants, so that after being detained by this, it was getting towards noon before he began to find the place he was looking for. The day was perfectly clear, calm, and hot. The morning moisture had dried up even in the forest, and myriads of mosquitoes literally covered his face, his back, his arms. His dog had turned from black to gray, its back being covered with mosquitoes, and so had Olin's coat, through which the insects thrust their stings. Olin was ready to run away from them, and it seemed to him that it was impossible to live in this country in the summer. He was about to go home, but remembering that other people managed to endure such pain, he resolved to bear it, and gave himself up to be devoured. And strange to say, by noontime, the feeling became actually pleasant. He even felt that without mosquito-filled atmosphere around him, and that mosquito paste mingled with perspiration which his hands smeared over his face, and that unceasing irritation all over his body, the forest would lose him for some of its charm and character. These myriads of insects were so well suited to that monstrously lavish wild vegetation, these multitudes of birds and beasts which filled the forest, this dark foliage, this hot scented air, these runlets filled with turbid water, which everywhere soaked through from the terrace and gurgled here and there under the overhanging leaves. That very thing which had at first seemed to him dreadful and intolerable now seemed pleasant. After going round the place where yesterday they had found the animal, and not finding anything, he felt inclined to rest. The sun stood right above the forest, and poured its perpendicular rays down on his back and head wherever he came out into a glade or onto the road. The 7 heavy pheasants dragged painfully at his waist. Having found the traces of yesterday's stag, he crept under a bush into the thicket just where the stag had lain, and lay down in its lair. He examined the dark foliage round him, the place marked by the stag's perspiration and yesterday's dung, the imprint of the stag's knees, the bit of black earth it had kicked up, and its own footprints of the day before. He felt cool and comfortable and did not think or wish for anything. And suddenly he was overcome by such a strange feeling of causeless joy and of love of everything, that from an old habit of his childhood, he began crossing himself and thanking someone. Suddenly, with extraordinary clearness, he thought, "Here I am, Dmitri Olnin, a being quite distinct from every other being, now laying all alone, heaven only knows where a stag used to live, an old stag, a beautiful stag, who perhaps had never seen a man, and in a place where no human being has ever sat or thought these thoughts. Here I sit, and around me stand old and young trees, one of them festooned with wild grapevines, and pheasants are fluttering, driving one another about, and perhaps scenting their murdered brothers." He felt his pheasants, examined them, and wiped the warm blood off his hand onto his coat. Perhaps the jackals scent them, and with dissatisfied faces go off in another direction. Above me, flying in among the leaves, which to them seem enormous islands, mosquitoes hang in the air and buzz. 1, 2, 3, 4, 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 mosquitoes, and all of them buzz something or another, and each one of them is separate from all else, and is just a separate Dmitri Olnin, as I am myself. He vividly imagined what the mosquitoes buzzed. This way, lads. Here's some one we can eat. They buzzed and stuck to him, and it was clear to him that he was not a Russian nobleman, a member of a Moscow society, the friend and relation of so-and-so and so-and-so, but just a mosquito, or pheasant, or deer, as those that were now living all around him, just as Daddy Eroshka, I shall live a while and die. And as he says truly, grass will grow and nothing more. But what though the grass does grow, he continued thinking. Still, I must live and be happy, because happiness is all I desire. Never mind what I am, an animal like all the rest, above whom the grass will grow and nothing more, or a frame in which a bit of the one God has been sent. Still, I must live in the very best way. How then must I live to be happy, and why was I not happy before? And he began to recall his former life, and he felt disgusted with himself. He appeared to himself to have been terribly exacting and selfish, though he now saw that all the while he really needed nothing for himself. And he looked round at the foliage, with the light shining through it, at the setting sun and the clear sky, and he felt just as happy as before. Why am I happy? And what I used to live for, he thought. How much I exacted for myself, and how I schemed and did not manage to gain anything but shame and sorrow. And there now I require nothing to be happy, and suddenly a new light seemed to reveal itself to him. Happiness is this, he said to himself. Happiness lies in living for others. That is evident. The desire for happiness is innate in every man, therefore it is legitimate. when trying to satisfy it selfishly, that is, by seeking for oneself riches, fame, comforts, or love, it may happen that circumstances arise which make it impossible to satisfy these desires. It follows that it is these desires that are illegitimate, but not the need for happiness. But what desires can always be satisfied despite external circumstances? What are they? Love? Self-sacrifice? He was so glad and excited when he had discovered this, as it seemed to him new truth, that he jumped up and began impatiently seeking someone to sacrifice himself for, to do good to, and to love. Since one wants nothing for oneself, he kept thinking, why not live for others? He took up his gun with the intention of returning home quickly to think this out and to find an opportunity of doing good. He made his way out of the thicket. When he had come out onto the glade, he looked around him. The sun was no longer visible above the treetops. It had grown cooler, and the place seemed to him quite strange, and not like the country round the village. Everything seemed changed, the weather and the character of the forest. The sky was wrapped in the clouds. The wind was rustling in the treetops, and all around nothing was visible but reeds and dying, broken-down trees. He called to his dog, who had run away to follow some animal, and his voice came back as in a desert. And suddenly he was seized with a terrible sense of weirdness. He grew frightened. He remembered the Albrechts and the murderers he had been told about, and he expected every moment that Albrecht would spring from behind every bush, and he would have to defend his life and die, or be a coward. He thought of God and of the future life as for long as he had not thought about them, and all around was that same gloomy, stern, wild nature. And is it worth while living for oneself, he thought, when at any moment you may die, and die without having done any good, and so that no one will know of it? He went in the direction where he fancied the village lay. Of his shooting he had no further thought, but he felt tired to death, and peered round at every bush and tree with particular attention, and almost with terror, expecting every moment to be called to account for his life. After having wandered about for a considerable time, he came upon a ditch, down which flowing cold, sandy water from the Terek, and, not to go astray any longer, he decided to follow it. He went on without knowing where the ditch would lead him. Suddenly, the reeds behind him cracked. He shuddered and seized his gun, and then, feeling ashamed of himself, the overexcited dog, panting hard, had thrown itself into the cold water of the ditch and was lapping it. He too had a drink, and then followed the dog in the direction it wished to go, thinking it would lead him to the village. But despite the dog's company, everything around him seemed still more dreary. The forest grew darker, and the wind grew stronger and stronger in the tops of the broken old trees. Some large birds circled, screeching round their nests in those trees. The vegetation grew poorer, and he came oftener and oftener upon rustling reeds and bare sandy spaces covered with animal footprints. To the howling of the wind was added another kind of cheerless, monotonous roar. Altogether, his spirits became gloomy. Putting his hand behind him, he felt his pheasants and found one missing. It had broken off and was lost, and only the bleeding head and beak remained sticking to his belt. He felt more frightened than he had ever done before. He began to pray to God and feared above all that he might die without having done anything good or kind. And he so wanted to live, and to live so as to perform a feat of self-sacrifice.